The morning of August 18, 1943, broke clear over Wewak, New Guinea. Second Lieutenant Thomas Maguire levelled his P-38 Lightning at 32,000 feet, the twin Allison engines humming smoothly in the thin stratospheric air. Below him, scattered across 6 miles of sky, 48 American bombers droned toward their target. And somewhere between them and the target, German-trained Luftwaffe pilots flying captured Japanese fighters waited in ambush. Maguire's hands rested lightly on the control column of his Lightning, the aircraft christened Pudgy after his wife's nickname. At this altitude, most fighters would be gasping for air, their engines starved by atmospheric pressure that measured less than a third of sea level. But the twin General Electric turbo superchargers, mounted in each engine nacelle of Maguire's P-38, were spinning at 21,000 revolutions per minute, compressing the thin air and forcing it into his engines with the density of air at 10,000 feet. He was flying an aircraft that could breathe where others suffocated, and he was about to prove it to pilots who believed altitude belonged to them alone. German military advisors had arrived in the Pacific Theatre in 1942, bringing with them years of combat experience from the European War. They taught Japanese pilots the tactics that had worked so devastatingly over Britain and Russia. Control the altitude, control the battle. Climb above your enemy, dive with the sun at your back, strike with overwhelming energy advantage, zoom back to altitude. It was doctrine written in the blood of thousands of Allied pilots. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But doctrine written against Spitfires and Hurricanes was about to meet an aircraft those European tacticians had never encountered. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was an anomaly, an engineering philosophy that violated almost every convention of fighter design. Where other fighters used a single engine, the Lightning used 2. Where others mounted guns in the wings, the Lightning concentrated all armament in the nose. Where others struggled above 25,000 feet, the Lightning excelled. And that excellence was about to become brutally apparent. The P-38 Lightning had begun its life in 1937, when the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification that seemed impossible. They wanted a fighter capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6.5 minutes, capable of flying at 360 miles per hour at that altitude, with a range of over 1,200 miles. These requirements were so demanding that several established manufacturers declined to bid. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, then a relatively small company in Burbank, California, saw an opportunity. Their chief designer, Hall Hibbard, led a team that included a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson. Together, they created something unprecedented. The XP-38 prototype that first flew on January 27, 1939, looked like nothing else in the sky. 2 engines, twin booms, a central nacelle, tricycle landing gear. And buried deep in each engine nacelle, invisible to observers on the ground, a technology that would rewrite the rules of high-altitude combat. Turbo superchargers were not new. Sanford Moss had developed the concept at General Electric during World War I, proving that exhaust-driven compressors could maintain engine power at altitude. But packaging these temperamental beasts into a fighter aircraft had defeated every previous attempt. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was thermodynamic. A turbo supercharger captures exhaust gases at 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit and uses that waste heat to spin a turbine. That turbine drives a compressor that forces air into the engine, but compressed air is hot air, and hot air is less dense. Feed hot air into an engine and you've defeated the entire purpose. The P-38 needed intercoolers, heat exchangers that would cool the compressed air before it entered the engines. Kelly Johnson's solution was elegant and complex in equal measure. Each engine nacelle became a self-contained power plant. The exhaust from the 12-cylinder Allison V1000 710 engine flowed through thick-walled steel ducting to the turbo supercharger mounted in the tail boom. The turbine spun, driving the compressor in the leading edge of the wing. Compressed air flowed through intercoolers mounted in the wing's leading edge, then back to the engine through more ducting. Oil systems, wastegates, regulators, all had to function flawlessly, or the system would tear itself apart. It was mechanically complex. It was heavy, adding hundreds of pounds to each engine installation. It was temperamental, requiring careful management by the pilot. But it worked. And more importantly, it worked at altitudes where no other American fighter could operate effectively. The Allison V-1710 engine produced approximately 1,300 horsepower at sea level. Without turbo supercharging, that power would drop to perhaps 450 horsepower at 30,000 feet, barely enough to keep a fighter airborne. With the General Electric B2 turbo supercharger installation, the P-38 could maintain over 1,000 horsepower at altitudes where enemy fighters were already struggling. This wasn't just an advantage, it was dominance. German fighter doctrine in 1943 was built around the performance characteristics of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190. These were superb aircraft, among the finest fighters produced by any nation. The Bf 109G variant, the most common model encountered by Allied pilots, could reach approximately 38,000 feet, but its performance degraded rapidly above 30,000 feet. The FW 190A, powered by a massive BMW radial engine, suffered even more dramatically at altitude, its performance falling off sharply above 20,000 feet. Both aircraft used mechanical superchargers, driven directly by the engine's crankshaft. These devices were reliable and relatively simple, but they stole horsepower from the engine to operate. At altitude, where every horsepower mattered desperately, that theft became crippling. A Bf 109G climbing to 35,000 feet was burning perhaps 40% of its available power just to drive the supercharger. What remained was barely sufficient for combat maneuvering. The P-38 Lightning, by contrast, was recovering energy that would otherwise blast uselessly out the exhaust pipes. Its turbo superchargers were powered by waste heat. Every horsepower the Allison engines produced was available for flying, for fighting, for winning. German pilots who encountered the Lightning quickly learned to respect this difference. Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 77 inches North Africa, later wrote that dogfighting with a Lightning at altitude was daunting. The twin-engined American fighter could maintain combat power in conditions where the Bf 109 was struggling just to stay airborne. But the real revelation came in the Pacific Theater, where American pilots flying P-38 seconds faced Japanese fighters optimized for low and medium altitude combat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a brilliant aircraft at 15,000 feet, capable of outturning anything the Allies could field. At 30,000 feet, it was nearly helpless. Major Richard Bong, who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all achieved in P-38 Lightnings, developed the tactics that would define high-altitude combat in the Pacific. His approach was simple: stay above them, dive when you have a shot, zoom back to altitude. The P-38's superior climb rate and ceiling made this possible. The Zero's superior maneuverability became irrelevant because Bong never gave Zero pilots the chance to use it. On that August morning over Wewak, Thomas Maguire was about to demonstrate these tactics with devastating effectiveness. The German advisors had taught their Japanese students well. A formation of enemy fighters climbed toward the American bombers, planning to attack with an altitude advantage. They reached 28,000 feet, straining at the upper limit of their performance envelope. Maguire and his fellow Lightning pilots waited 4,000 feet above them. The psychology of aerial combat at altitude is different from sea-level dogfighting. At low altitude, a pilot can see his opponent clearly, can judge distance and angle with practiced instinct. At 30,000 feet, the air is so thin that visibility extends for hundreds of miles. An enemy fighter 10 miles away is visible as a tiny speck, and that speck might be above you or below you, closing at hundreds of miles per hour or climbing away to safety. The pilot with the altitude advantage holds all the cards. He can choose to attack or not. He can dive, using gravity to add speed to his approach. He can make a firing pass and zoom back to altitude before his target can react. The lower pilot is trapped, forced to watch helplessly as his enemy circles overhead, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. German and Japanese pilots who had dominated the early years of the war suddenly found themselves in the unfamiliar position of looking up. They watched as American lightnings circled lazily thousands of feet above them, twin-boomed silhouettes against the stratosphere, and they knew that when those lightnings came down, there would be nowhere to run. Maguire saw the enemy formation below him. 40 Japanese fighters, climbing hard, their engines labouring in the thin air. He checked his instruments, oil pressure steady, coolant temperatures normal, both turbo superchargers operating smoothly, maintaining manifold pressure at 42 inches of mercury, the same pressure they would have shown at sea level. He rolled his Lightning into a dive. At 32,000 feet, the speed of sound is approximately 660 miles per hour. The P-38 could approach that speed in a steep dive, and at those velocities, strange things began to happen. Airflow across the wings would approach transonic speeds, creating shock waves that buffeted the aircraft and made the controls sluggish and unresponsive. Early P-38 pilots called it compressibility, and it had killed more than one pilot who pushed his Lightning too hard in a dive. But by 1943, Lockheed had developed dive flaps, small surfaces that extended from the lower wing surface and changed the pressure distribution in a way that kept the aircraft controllable. Maguire's P-38J had these flaps. He deployed them as his airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. The Lightning remained stable, responsive, deadly. The Japanese pilots below saw him coming. They tried to scatter, to break formation and make themselves harder targets. But at 28,000 feet, their aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs. Maneuvering at altitude requires power, and power was exactly what their engines couldn't provide. Maguire selected his target, a fighter slightly separated from the main formation. His thumb found the firing button on the control column. The P-38's nose armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose and aimed directly forward, could pour an incredible volume of fire into a small area. There was no convergence issue as with wing-mounted guns. Everything Maguire aimed at would be hit by all 5 weapons simultaneously. He fired. The Lightning shuddered as the guns roared. 250 feet ahead of him, the Japanese fighter disintegrated. Maguire continued his dive, building speed, heading for the safety of low altitude where his Lightning's superior speed would protect him. Behind him, his wingman claimed another kill, and above, 3 more P-38 seconds rolled into their own attacks. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The Lightnings destroyed 11 enemy fighters without loss. The bombers completed their mission unmolested, and somewhere in the post-mission debriefing, a pattern became clear. The P-38 Lightning had found its role. The altitude advantage the P-38 enjoyed wasn't just about engine performance. It was about system integration, about matching every component of the aircraft to the demands of high-altitude operation. The cockpit was pressurized in later variants, keeping pilots comfortable and alert when other fighter pilots were suffering from hypoxia and frostbite. The hydraulic boost on the controls made the aircraft responsive, even when aerodynamic forces at high speed were trying to overpower the pilot. The twin engines meant that a single hit didn't mean death, a crucial advantage when operating hundreds of miles from base. But most importantly, the turbo supercharger installation meant that the P-38 could maintain combat power at altitudes where the laws of physics were defeating every other fighter in the sky. German intelligence officers, analyzing reports from the Pacific Theater in late 1943, began to notice a disturbing pattern. Their Japanese allies were suffering catastrophic losses to an American fighter that seemed to operate with impunity at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Luftwaffe pilots who had encountered Lightnings over North Africa and Europe reported similar experiences. The twin-boomed American fighter wasn't particularly agile at medium altitudes, but above 25,000 feet, it became progressively more dangerous. One Luftwaffe pilot's combat report from late 1943 captures the frustration perfectly. We climbed to intercept the bombers at 30,000 feet. Our engines were at maximum power. Our aircraft were at phaser, the edge of their performance. And above us, the American escort fighters circled effortlessly, waiting. When we attacked the bombers, they dove on us with tremendous speed. We could not escape, could not outclimb them. 3 of our aircraft were lost. We shot down none of theirs. The story of how the P-38 achieved this altitude supremacy begins not with combat, but with a single mathematical insight that Lockheed's engineering team grasped in 1937. While other manufacturers were designing fighters to excel at the altitudes where most combat occurred, 15 to 25,000 feet, Kelly Johnson and his team were designing for the altitudes where combat would need to occur. The difference was prophetic. European air combat in 1939 and 1940 was validating every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about fighter design. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E could reach 36,000 feet, higher than any Allied fighter then in service. German bombers operated at 20 to 23,000 feet, confident that British fighters would struggle to intercept them with sufficient energy remaining for combat. The tactic worked brilliantly during the early stages of the Battle of Britain, but it worked only because the RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires were using mechanical superchargers that limited their effective ceiling. When those fighters climbed to 30,000 feet to engage German bombers, they arrived with barely enough power to maneuver. The Bf 109 escorts, waiting several thousand feet higher, could dive on them at will. Lockheed's engineers had studied these reports with intense interest. They understood that future air combat would push relentlessly higher, that whoever controlled the stratosphere would control the sky. The turbo supercharger installation on the P-38 wasn't just an engineering solution. It was a strategic weapon, a way to seize the high ground before the enemy even realized the high ground existed. The first P-38 seconds arrived in the European theatre in the summer of 1942, but were immediately diverted to North Africa for Operation Torch. Their performance there was mixed, hampered by maintenance issues, inexperienced pilots, and combat at altitudes where the Lightning's advantages were less pronounced. German pilots claimed numerous P-38 seconds during these early encounters, and reports began circulating in the Luftwaffe that the American twin-engine fighter was an easy kill. These reports were catastrophically wrong. The P-38 seconds fighting in North Africa were early models, P-38F and P-38G variants that lacked many refinements. Their turbo supercharger systems were temperamental in the desert heat. Their intercoolers, designed for high-altitude operations, performed poorly in the hot, dusty conditions of North Africa. Pilots were still learning the aircraft's quirks, still discovering the tactics that would make it deadly. But in the Pacific, where P-38 seconds began arriving in significant numbers in early 1943, conditions were different. The vast distances over open ocean meant that combat occurred at the altitudes where the Lightning excelled. The Japanese fighters, optimized for the low and medium altitude combat that had characterized the early months of the Pacific War, found themselves facing an opponent that rewrote the tactical rulebook. Captain Thomas Lynch, who would eventually score 21 victories before being killed by anti-aircraft fire, described the P-38's advantage in a letter home in March 1943. "The Japanese pilots are skilled and brave. Their Zeros can turn inside anything we have, but we don't turn with them. We climb above them, to 30 or 35,000 feet, where our engines are still making full power, and theirs are gasping for air. Then we dive, make one pass, and climb back up. They can't follow us. They can't catch us. They can't hurt us. It's not fair, but war never is." Tactics, refined and codified by Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and dozens of other Lightning pilots, became known as boom and zoom. The name was descriptive. P-38 seconds would boom down from altitude, fire a burst at high closing speed, and zoom back to altitude using their superior power-to-weight ratio at extreme heights. Japanese pilots flying Zeros, Hayabusas, or even the late-war Ki-84 Franks found this tactic impossible to counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A Japanese fighter at 30,000 feet was operating at the absolute edge of its performance envelope. The engine was producing perhaps 60% of its rated power. The thin air meant that control surfaces were less effective, requiring larger inputs to achieve the same maneuvering. The pilot, often without supplemental oxygen, was suffering from hypoxia, his judgment impaired, his reactions slow. The P-38 Lightning at the same altitude was operating comfortably within its capabilities. The turbo superchargers were maintaining near sea-level manifold pressure. The engines were producing nearly full power. The pilot, in a cockpit that would be pressurized in later variants, was alert and responsive. When the P-38 dove, it used gravity to add speed, arriving at the target with tremendous energy. When it climbed back to altitude, the powerful Allison engines, force-fed dense air by the turbo superchargers, could sustain climb rates that left pursuing Japanese fighters wallowing in the thin atmosphere. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was devastating. They had begun the war with a sense of invincibility, flying fighters that could outmaneuver anything the Allies possessed. Now they faced an enemy that refused to fight on terms where maneuverability mattered. Japanese combat reports from mid-1943 onward reflect growing frustration and fear. One report, from a Zero pilot, translated by American intelligence after the war, describes an encounter in August 1943. We sighted the enemy bombers at 25,000 feet and began our attack climb. We reached 28,000 feet, our engines laboring badly. Above us, we could see the American escort fighters, the twin-tailed ones we call the two planes, one body. They were much higher than us, perhaps 4,000 feet higher. We continued climbing, hoping to reach them before they attacked. But before we could climb higher, they came down. They were so fast, faster than anything I have seen. They fired and climbed away before we could turn to engage them. We lost 4 aircraft in the first attack. They climbed back to altitude and circled above us, waiting to attack again. We could not reach them. We could not escape them. It was like hunting birds with only stones, while they had rifles. The admission is remarkable, not just for what it says about the P-38's performance, but for what it reveals about the psychological dimension of altitude advantage. Japanese pilots, among the most skilled and determined in the world, were reduced to helplessness by an aircraft that could simply outclimb them. German pilots in the European theatre were learning similar lessons, though the learning came more slowly. The Bf-109G could reach higher altitudes than the P-38, and the late-war K model could match or exceed the Lightning's ceiling. But ceiling is different from combat effectiveness at altitude. The Bf-109 could reach 41,000 feet, but at that altitude it was barely controllable, its engine producing minimal power, its controls mushy and unresponsive. The P-38J, which entered service in the spring of 1944, could reach 44,000 feet. But more importantly, it could fight at 35,000 feet, maintaining full combat power, executing high-speed maneuvers, climbing and diving with authority. The difference between reaching an altitude and owning an altitude was the difference between defeat and victory. Luftwaffe combat reports from late 1944 reflect a grudging respect for the Lightning's high-altitude capabilities. One report from a Bf-109 pilot describes an encounter over Italy. We were at maximum altitude, attempting to intercept American bombers. The P-38 escort was several thousand feet above us. When we began our attack on the bombers, the Lightnings dove on us. We attempted to outturn them, but at this altitude, our controls were ineffective. We lost 3 aircraft. The Americans lost none. After this engagement, we received orders to avoid combat with P-38 seconds above 30,000 feet unless the tactical situation absolutely required it. That final sentence is telling. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with overwhelming tactical advantages in altitude and energy management, was now instructing pilots to avoid combat with an American fighter at high altitude. The strategic implications were profound. By mid-1944, the combined effect of P-38 seconds, P-51 Mustangs, and P-47 Thunderbolts had achieved complete air superiority over both Germany and the Pacific. But in that trinity of American fighters, the P-38 held a unique position. The P-51 had longer range, the P-47 was tougher and could carry heavier bomb loads. But the P-38 could fight at altitudes where the other two struggled, could maintain combat effectiveness in conditions where physics was defeating lesser aircraft. The technical achievement this represented cannot be overstated. Lockheed had taken a technology that every other manufacturer considered too complex, too heavy, too temperamental for fighters, and had made it work. The twin-turbo superchargers on the P-38 required constant pilot attention. The wastegates had to be managed carefully to prevent overboost. The intercoolers could ice over in certain conditions. The oil systems demanded vigilant monitoring. A pilot flying a P-38 was managing two complete power plants, each with its own turbo supercharger system, its own cooling systems, its own potential failure modes. But in exchange for that complexity, the P-38 pilot gained something no other Allied fighter pilot possessed: absolute freedom of the vertical. He could climb to any altitude the mission required. He could fight at any altitude combat demanded. He could use the third dimension of aerial combat in ways that enemy pilots, trapped by the limitations of mechanical supercharging, could only watch helplessly. Richard Bong's final victory, his 40th, came on December 17, 1944, over Mindoro, in the Philippines. He was flying a P-38 liters, the ultimate production variant of the Lightning, with improved turbo supercharger reliability and increased power. The engagement occurred at 33,000 feet. Japanese Ki-84 Frank fighters, some of the best aircraft Japan produced, attempted to intercept American bombers. Bong and his wingman dove from 37,000 feet, destroyed two Franks in a single pass, and climbed back to altitude before the remaining Japanese fighters could react. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The Japanese pilots never had a chance to fire their weapons. They were killed by an aircraft that could outclimb them, outdive them, and maintain combat power at altitudes where their engines were suffocating. It was the perfect demonstration of what altitude supremacy meant in practical terms. After the war, captured Luftwaffe documents revealed the extent to which German intelligence had underestimated the P-38. Early reports dismissed it as inferior to the Bf-109 and Fw-190. By 1944, those assessments had changed dramatically. One German technical intelligence report from late 1944 analyzes the P-38's turbo supercharger installation in detail, concluding, "The American aircraft represents a fundamental challenge to NDLA, our fighter doctrine. We have optimized our designs for combat at medium altitudes, where mechanical supercharging is effective. The Americans have built a fighter that owns the stratosphere. Unless we can develop equivalent high-altitude capabilities, we will continue to lose the altitude advantage in every engagement." That loss of altitude advantage had cascading effects throughout the German air defense system. Bombers could operate at higher altitudes, where flak was less accurate and fighter interceptions were more difficult. Escort fighters could position themselves above both bombers and defenders, able to intervene at will. The entire tactical architecture of strategic bombing, which had nearly failed in 1943 when unescorted bombers suffered catastrophic losses, became viable once P-38 seconds, P-51 seconds, and P-47 seconds achieved altitude supremacy. In the Pacific, the effect was even more pronounced. Japanese air power, which had dominated the first year of the war, was systematically destroyed by American fighters that could choose when, where, and how to fight. The P-38's altitude advantage wasn't the only factor in this destruction, but it was decisive. Japanese pilots couldn't protect their bombers, couldn't intercept American raids, couldn't contest control of the air because American fighters operated at altitudes Japanese fighters couldn't effectively reach. The human cost of this technological advantage is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. American pilots flying P-38 seconds in the Pacific Theater had significantly lower casualty rates than pilots flying other aircraft types. The Lightning's twin engines provided a margin of safety that single-engine fighters couldn't match. Its altitude capabilities meant that P-38 pilots could often avoid unfavorable combat entirely, choosing to engage only when conditions favored them. Of the approximately 10,000 P-38 seconds built during the war, roughly 1,300 were lost to all causes in the colorful Pacific Theater. Combat losses accounted for perhaps half of that total. The exchange ratio, P-38 seconds lost to enemy aircraft destroyed, was approximately 1:5. For every Lightning lost in combat, 5 enemy aircraft were destroyed. That ratio compares favorably with any fighter of the war. The survivors of those Pacific air battles, men like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, Charles MacDonald and Thomas Lynch, became legends. But behind their individual achievements was a technological reality that made their success possible. They flew an aircraft that could breathe at 40,000 feet, that could maintain combat power in the stratosphere, that could use altitude as both sword and shield. The engineering legacy of the P-38's turbo supercharger installation extends far beyond World War II. Every modern jet engine, every turbocharged automobile, every high-altitude aircraft flying today owes a debt to the principles proven by Lockheed's Lightning. The concept of using exhaust energy to compress intake air, of recovering waste heat and converting it into useful work, became foundational to post-war aviation development. But in 1943 and 1944, when the outcome of the war still hung in balance, the P-38's altitude capabilities represented something more immediate and more vital. They represented survival. Lieutenant Robert Aschenbrenner, flying with the 49th Fighter Group in New Guinea, described the psychological security of altitude advantage in a letter written in June 1943. "We take off before dawn, climb to 35,000 feet, and wait for the Japanese to come. Sometimes we wait for hours, circling in the thin air, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. The Japanese bombers come in at 20 to 25,000 feet. Their escorts climb as high as they can, maybe 28 or 30,000 if they push their engines hard. But we're above them, always above them. And from up here, we're invincible. We can see everything. We can attack when we want. We can leave when we want. The Japanese can't touch us unless we let them." That sense of invincibility, of owning the vertical dimension of combat, was precisely what Lockheed's engineers had intended when they designed the turbo supercharger installation. They had created not just a high-altitude fighter, but a fighter that transformed altitude from a number on an altimeter into a tactical weapon. The contrast with German and Japanese fighter doctrine couldn't have been more stark. Both nations had built their air forces around the concept of fighters as interceptors, aircraft designed to climb quickly to intercept enemy bombers, engage them briefly, and return to base. This doctrine worked brilliantly in the early years of the war, when combat occurred at predictable altitudes and enemy fighters had limited range. But by 1943, the nature of air combat had changed fundamentally. Bombers were flying higher, protected by fighters with ranges measured in thousands of miles. The interceptor doctrine that had worked so well in 1940 and 1941 was failing. Luftwaffe and Japanese fighters could still intercept bomber formations, but they arrived at the intercept altitude with minimal energy reserves, vulnerable to escort fighters circling overhead. The Americans, British, and Soviets adapted to this new reality with varying degrees of success. The British pushed the development of the Spitfire to higher marks, with improved supercharging that increased ceiling and high-altitude performance. The Soviets focused on low and medium-altitude combat, where most Eastern Front engagements occurred. The Americans built the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt with its massive turbo supercharger, and eventually acquired the P-51 Mustang with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and two-stage supercharging. Of these solutions, the P-38's was the most comprehensive. It wasn't just capable of high-altitude combat, it was optimized for it. Every system on the aircraft, from the pressurized cockpit to the hydraulically boosted controls, was designed to function effectively at altitudes that would cripple other fighters. The Germans recognized this advantage and attempted to counter it. The Focke-Wulf TAR-152, a long wingspan development of the FW-190, was designed specifically for high-altitude interception. It used a Junkers Jumo 213 engine with a three-stage supercharger and could reach nearly 50,000 feet. But the TAR-152 entered service in January 1945, when Germany's situation was already hopeless. Only 43 were built before the war ended. The Messerschmitt Bf 109H, another high-altitude variant, used extended wings and improved supercharging to reach nearly 48,000 feet. It never entered production. The Me-209, the Me-309, various other projects attempted to match the high-altitude capabilities of American fighters. All failed, not because German engineers lacked skill, but because they lacked time and resources. By late 1944, German industry was collapsing under sustained Allied bombing. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, running out of pilots, running out of time. Even if German engineers had successfully developed a fighter that could match the P-38's altitude capabilities, there would have been no fuel to fly it, no trained pilots to fly it, no factories to build it in sufficient numbers. In the Pacific, Japanese engineers faced similar challenges. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden was designed as a high-altitude interceptor, with a turbocharged Kasei engine that could maintain power above 30,000 feet. It entered service in late 1943, but suffered from reliability problems and never achieved the altitude performance its designers intended. The Kawasaki Ki 102, another high-altitude design, entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. The simple truth was that by 1944, the Allies had achieved technological superiority in high-altitude combat, and neither Germany nor Japan could close the gap. The P-38 Lightning, along with the P-47 Thunderbolt and improved marks of the Spitfire, owned the stratosphere. Enemy fighters could reach those altitudes, but they couldn't fight effectively there. Thomas Maguire's death on January 7, 1945, in some ways illustrated both the P-38's strengths and the eternal truth that altitude advantage cannot protect a pilot from his own decisions. Maguire was leading a 4-ship patrol over Negros Island in the Philippines when they encountered a lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar at low altitude. Maguire's own tactical manual, written for the 5th Air Force, explicitly warned against engaging enemy fighters at low altitude while carrying drop tanks. But Maguire was desperate to surpass Richard Bong's score of 40 victories. He was at 38, and Bong had been rotated back to the United States. The war might end before Maguire got another chance. When a Japanese Ki-84 Frank joined the engagement and began firing at Maguire's wingman, Maguire attempted a hard turn at 300 feet altitude while still carrying his external fuel tanks. The P-38 stalled. At that altitude, there was no time to recover. Maguire died on impact. His death was ruled pilot error, a violation of his own tactics, a reminder that no aircraft, no matter how capable, can protect a pilot from poor decisions. But Maguire's 38 victories, every one of them achieved in a P-38 Lightning, testified to the aircraft's capabilities when flown correctly. His tactical manual, preserved in Air Force archives, reads like a love letter to altitude advantage. Always maintain altitude superiority. Never engage below 15,000 feet if you can avoid it. Use your superior climb rate to gain altitude before entering combat. Make your pass from above, at high speed. Do not try to turn with the enemy. Use your speed to extend away, climb back to altitude, and prepare for another pass. The P-38 at altitude is superior to any fighter the Japanese have. Use that advantage ruthlessly. Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace, survived the war only to die in a test flight accident on August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. He was testing the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, when the engine flamed out on takeoff. Like Maguire, Bong died at low altitude, in an aircraft without the margin for error that the twin-engined P-38 would have provided. Both men were awarded the Medal of Honor. Both are remembered as exemplars of American fighter pilot skill and courage, but their achievements were enabled by an aircraft that gave them advantages their enemies couldn't match. The P-38 Lightning's turbo superchargers, those temperamental, complex, heavy installations that conventional wisdom said couldn't work in a fighter, had proven to be decisive. In post-war interviews and reunions, surviving Luftwaffe and Japanese pilots consistently identified the P-38 as one of the most dangerous opponents they faced. Not because it was faster at low altitude, it wasn't. Not because it was more maneuverable, it wasn't. But because it could choose when and where to fight, could attack from altitudes enemy fighters couldn't effectively reach, could disengage at will by climbing into the thin air where pursuit was impossible. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war with 33 victories, wrote in his memoir, "The P-38 was not the fastest American fighter, nor the most agile, but it was the most frustrating to engage. They would circle above us at altitudes where our engines were barely running. When we tried to attack the bombers, they would dive on us with tremendous speed. We could not outclimb them. We could not outdive them. We could only try to survive their attacks and hope they would make a mistake. They rarely did." That admission, from a skilled and experienced German pilot, captures the essence of what altitude supremacy meant in practical terms. It meant that the P-38 pilot held the initiative. He could attack or not, as he chose. He could engage favorable targets and avoid unfavorable ones. He could fight when conditions suited him and leave when they didn't. The enemy, trapped at lower altitudes by the limitations of their engines, could only react. The cost of developing this capability was significant. The P-38 was expensive, costing approximately $97,000 per aircraft in 1944, equivalent to roughly $1.3 million today. That was nearly twice the cost of a P-51 Mustang and substantially more than a P-47 Thunderbolt. The maintenance burden was heavy, with two engines requiring twice the servicing, and the turbo supercharger systems demanding constant attention. But the alternative was unacceptable. Without high-altitude fighters, American bombers would have faced the same catastrophic losses in late 1943 and early 1944 that they suffered in the missions before effective fighter escort became available. The second Schweinfurt raid, on October 14, 1943, cost 60 B-17 seconds lost and 17 more damaged beyond repair, out of a force of 291. The 8th Air Force couldn't sustain such losses. Without fighters that could escort bombers to their targets and fight effectively at bomber operating altitudes, the entire strategic bombing campaign would have failed. The P-38, along with the P-47 and later the P-51, made strategic bombing viable. And of those three fighters, the P-38 was the first to provide truly effective high-altitude escort, operational in Europe by late 1943, when the Mustang was still working through teething problems and the Thunderbolt was being optimized for its role. The production history of the P-38 reflects its importance to the war effort. Lockheed built 10,037 Lightnings between 1941 and 1945. At peak production in 1944, the Burbank factory was completing one P-38 every hour. Workers, many of them women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, assembled the complex aircraft with remarkable efficiency. The quality control was strict. A single flaw in a turbo supercharger installation could cause catastrophic failure at altitude. The factories that built P-38 seconds also served as training grounds for post-war American aerospace supremacy. Engineers who learned to package complex systems into fighter aircraft went on to design the jets that would dominate the Cold War. Workers who assembled turbo superchargers with microscopic tolerances carried those skills into the civilian economy. The P-38 production program wasn't just building fighters, it was building the foundation of America's aerospace industry. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the P-38's role in the European theatre was diminishing. The P-51 Mustang had taken over most escort duties, with its longer range and lower fuel consumption. But in the Pacific, P-38 seconds continued to fly combat missions until the last day of the war. They were attacking Japanese positions on mainland Asia when the surrender was announced. They flew reconnaissance missions over the Japanese home islands in the final weeks before the atomic bombs ended the conflict. The last combat sortie flown by a P-38 occurred in August 1945, a reconnaissance mission over northern Honshu. The pilot, whose name is not recorded in available records, climbed to 38,000 feet, photographed Japanese military installations, and returned to base without incident. It was an unremarkable mission, the kind of routine high-altitude operation that the P-38 had been designed to perform. But it represented the culmination of 8 years of development, from the first flight of the XP-38 inches 1939 to the end of the war. In those 8 years, the P-38 Lightning had proven that altitude could be dominated, that turbo supercharging could work in fighters, that complexity was acceptable if it delivered capabilities nothing else could match. The aircraft had been called Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, by Luftwaffe pilots who learned to fear it. It had been the mount of America's greatest aces. It had escorted thousands of bombers to their targets and brought them home safely. It had proven, beyond any doubt, that whoever controlled the highest altitude controlled the sky. The pilots who flew P-38 seconds carried their respect for the aircraft throughout their lives. At reunions decades after the war, aging veterans would stand beside restored Lightnings, running their hands over the aluminum skin, remembering missions flown in their youth. They would point out the turbo supercharger installations, hidden in the aft sections of the engine nacelles, and explain to younger generations how those complex mechanisms had given them life. One such veteran, speaking at a reunion in the 1980s, captured the essence perfectly. People ask me what it was like to fly the Lightning. I tell them it was like being a bird of prey. We flew higher than anyone else. We saw everything. We struck when we wanted, where we wanted. The Japanese couldn't touch us. The Germans couldn't catch us. We owned the sky above 30,000 feet, and from up there, we were invincible. That feeling, that absolute confidence that you held the altitude advantage, that made all the difference. It meant we came home. It meant we won. That confidence, that sense of owning the vertical dimension of combat, was exactly what Lockheed's engineers had designed into the aircraft. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just a fighter. It was a statement of engineering philosophy, a declaration that altitude supremacy was achievable, that complexity was manageable, that American industrial and engineering capability could solve problems other nations considered unsolvable. The Luftwaffe aces who faced P-38 seconds over Europe and the Pacific could not believe, at first, that an American fighter could outclimb them at 40,000 feet. They had been trained to believe that German engineering was superior, that Luftwaffe fighters were the finest in the world, that altitude belonged to them by right of skill and experience. The P-38 Lightning proved them wrong. It proved that altitude belonged not to the most skilled pilots or the most experienced air force, but to whoever built the best aircraft. And in the realm of high-altitude combat, between 1943 and 1945, the best aircraft was an American twin-boomed fighter with 2 turbo superchargers and a price tag that made accountants wince. The Luftwaffe aces learned this lesson the hard way, watching from below as Lightnings circled overhead, untouchable, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They learned it in debriefings, where combat reports consistently showed P-38 seconds engaging from altitude advantage and escaping before effective counterattacks could be mounted. They learned it in the steadily mounting loss rates, as German fighters were destroyed by an enemy they couldn't reach. And in the end, they admitted it. In post-war interviews, in memoirs, in the quiet conversations between former enemies at aviation museums and air shows, German pilots acknowledged what the P-38 represented. It was the aircraft that took altitude away from them. It was the fighter that dominated the stratosphere. It was proof that American engineering, dismissed by many Europeans as crude and unsophisticated, could produce weapons that defeated the finest products of German industry. One final story captures this perfectly. In 1961, at an aviation reunion in Germany, a former Luftwaffe pilot encountered an American veteran who had flown P-38 seconds. They discovered they had been in the same airspace over Berlin on March 3, 1944, when P-38 seconds from the 55th Fighter Group flew the first Allied fighter escort mission to the German capital. The German pilot had been flying a Bf-109G, attempting to intercept American bombers at 30,000 feet. The American had been flying top cover at 35,000 feet. The American remembered diving through the German formation, destroying one Bf-109 inches his pass. The German remembered looking up and seeing the lightning dive on his formation, seeing his wingman's aircraft explode, being unable to climb high enough to engage the attacker. They stood together, two old men who had tried to kill each other 20 years earlier, and the German asked the question that had haunted him for 2 decades. "How did you climb so high? Our engines couldn't maintain power above 30,000 feet, but you were 5,000 feet above us, circling, waiting. How?" The American pilot smiled and pointed to a photograph on the wall, a cutaway drawing of a P-38's engine nacelle, showing the turbo supercharger installation. "Those," he said, "twin turbo superchargers. They let us breathe where you couldn't. They gave us the altitude advantage. And altitude won the war." The German pilot studied the photograph for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Altitude won the war. We learned that. But we learned it too late." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.